I never believed in ghosts. Not really. I've always been a logical one, the kind of person who looks for a reasonable explanation behind every bump in the night. That was, of course, until I spent 3 weeks in that house. Even now, telling this story makes my stomach churn. It all started with a plan. The idea was simple: buy an old house, fix it up, and sell it for a profit. When the ad for the Victorian mansion on Blackthorn Hill popped up, it seemed like fate. The price was unbelievably low, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe the owners just wanted it gone. The first time I saw the house, I couldn't deny its eerie charm. It stood at the top of a hill, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was colder up there, and the house itself seemed to loom over everything, watching. The house was massive, with intricate woodwork, stained glass windows, and a spiral staircase that led to an attic we hadn't yet explored. It was beautiful in a sad, broken way, like it had been waiting for someone to bring it back to life. The first few days were exhausting. I threw myself into the work, tearing up floorboards, patching walls, and trying to make sense of the chaotic wiring. The silence of the house during the day was almost peaceful, interrupted only by the sound of tools and the occasional groan of the old wood shifting. But the nights were a different story. The first night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps overhead. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, like someone was pacing back and forth. I told myself it was the old house settling. It had to be. The second night, the whisper started. Faint at first, just on the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. By the end of the first week, I'd begun to notice something strange about the attic. The door was locked, and none of the keys we found fit. It wasn't just that it was locked, it felt wrong. The air around it was colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing on the other side listening. The whispers grew louder each night, and I began to notice other things. Objects weren't where I'd left them. Doors I knew I'd closed were wide open when I turned around. Once, I woke up to find a set of dusty footprints leading from the staircase to the foot of my bed and nowhere else. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the work. But the harder I tried, the worse it got. It was during one of my late-night attempts to avoid sleeping that I found it. A small leather-bound diary hidden in a false drawer of the library desk. The pages were brittle, the handwriting neat but frantic. The entries were written by someone who had lived in the house long before me. They spoke of loneliness, of anger, and of rituals performed in the attic to bring someone or something back. The last entry chilled me to the bone. He will return. I just need one more. I slammed the book shut, my hands shaking. For the first time since arriving, I felt a deep, gnawing fear. I couldn't ignore the attic any longer. Armed with a crowbar, I forced the door open. The room beyond was stifling, the air thick with dust and something heavier, something that made it hard to breathe. In the center of the room was a single wooden chair, facing a large, cracked mirror. The walls were covered in symbols, crudely carved into the wood. And then there was a smell, something sweet and rotting. I stepped closer to the mirror, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my reflection. But as I moved, it didn't. The figure in the mirror was pale, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin that seemed to stretch far beyond what was natural. It raised a hand, and I felt cold fingers brush against my shoulder. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone, but the symbols on the wall seemed to glow faintly, pulsing like they were alive. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The whispers were louder than ever, and the footsteps weren't just above me. They were in the hallway, outside my door. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. I packed what little I could carry and left the rest behind. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood there, silent and still, but I swear I saw someone standing in the attic window, watching me leave. I never went back. I couldn't. The house was sold at auction a year later, but I've never been able to find out who bought it or what happened to them. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of whispers. They're faint, almost inaudible, but they're there. And every so often, I see something out of the corner of my eye, a pale face, a hollow gaze, watching, waiting. I've always loved the outdoors. There's something about the quiet of the forest, the way the air smells of pine and earth, that's always made me feel at peace. That's why the idea of renting a remote lodge for a weekend getaway seemed perfect. A chance to escape the noise of the city and reconnect with nature. But some places are quiet for a reason. The lodge was about 3 hours from the city, tucked deep in a forest that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The directions were simple enough, but as I got closer, the road narrowed, turning from asphalt to gravel and then to dirt. The trees pressed in on either side, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. By the time I reaching the lodge, the sun was beginning to set. The building was rustic, almost charming, with a sloping roof and a wraparound porch. It looked like something out of a postcard, at least from the outside. Inside, the lodge was simple but comfortable. The main room had a stone fireplace, a worn leather couch, and a bookshelf filled with old paperbacks. There was no Wi-Fi, no television, not even cell service. Just the sounds of the forest and the crackle of the fire I built to chase away the chill. The first few hours were peaceful. I read a little, cooked a simple meal, and went to bed early, exhausted from the drive. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. Then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like someone was gently knocking on the window. The lodge had only one bedroom, and the window was right next to the bed. I lay there, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just a branch or an animal. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Gathering my courage, I rolled over and peeked out through the curtain. Nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of the trees. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. I spent the day hiking, exploring the trails that wound through the forest. It was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. As I made my way back to the lodge, I found something strange. Near the edge of the property, there was a clearing with an old, crumbling stone well. It wasn't on the map, and it looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer. The air around the well was colder, and as I peered into the darkness, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. I didn't stick around to investigate. That night, the tapping came again, louder this time. It wasn't just at the bedroom window. It was at every window. The sound moved from one to the next, circling the lodge. I turned on every light, hoping to scare off whatever animal was responsible. But when I looked outside, the clearing around the lodge was empty. Then the knocking stopped and the whispers began. They were faint at first, like the ones I'd heard near the well. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but there was an urgency to them, a desperate, pleading tone. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just the wind. But then I heard footsteps on the porch. The front door rattled, like someone was trying to handle. My heart was in my throat as I grabbed the fire poker and crept toward the door. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. The rattling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard a voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, and it sounded wrong, like someone trying to mimic a human voice, but not quite getting it right. "Let me in," it said. I froze. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to open the door, not to let it in. The voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Please, I'm cold." I backed away, gripping the fire poker like it was the only thing keeping me alive. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed by the fireplace, every light in the lodge blazing. The whispers and footsteps continued through the night, circling the lodge, stopping occasionally at the windows. By dawn, the sound stopped. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, unnatural. I packed my things and left without looking back. A week later, I got curious. I looked up the lodge online, trying to find out more about the property. That's when I found the news articles. Years ago, a family had stayed there. They disappeared without a trace, their cars still parked outside, their belongings untouched. The only clue was a set of footprints leading from the lodge to the old stone well. I haven't been back to the forest since. Sometimes, though, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear faint whispers outside my window, and I wonder if I brought something back with me. I've always loved hotels. There's something exciting about staying in a new place, surrounded by strangers, where every room holds a story you'll never know. But after what happened in that hotel, I'll never look at them the same way again. It was a business trip, a last-minute assignment that left me scrambling to find a place to stay. The hotel wasn't fancy, just a modest, slightly outdated building on the edge of town. It had the basics. Clean rooms, a small lobby, and a vaguely unsettling quiet that I didn't think much about at the time. I checked in late, tired from the drive, and the receptionist handed me a key to room 303. The elevator ride up was uneventful, though I couldn't help noticing how dim the lights were in the hallway. It felt like the bulbs were struggling to stay alive, flickering faintly as I made my way to my room. Room 303 was at the very end of the hall. The door looked like every other door, but as I slid the key into the lock, a strange feeling washed over me. It was subtle, just a flicker of unease, like I was intruding somewhere I didn't belong. The room itself was ordinary. A bed, a small desk, a television, and a window with heavy curtains. But it was cold, colder than the rest of the hotel. I fiddled with the thermostat, but it didn't seem to make a difference. I chalked it up to an old building with lousy heating, unpacked my things, and climbed into bed, eager for sleep. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was silent, the kind of silence that felt oppressive, like even the air was holding its breath. Then I noticed a shadow. It was on the wall opposite the bed, a vague, human-like shape cast by the faint glow of the streetlight outside. I thought it was just my imagination until it moved. It didn't walk or shift like a normal shadow. It rippled, stretching and shrinking, almost as if it were trying to pull itself free from the wall. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow seemed to notice me, or at least that's what it felt like. It stopped moving, and for a long, agonizing moment, it just lingered there, motionless. Then, slowly, it slid across the wall and disappeared into the corner. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I went to the front desk. I didn't want to sound like a lunatic, so I casually asked the receptionist if the hotel had ever had issues with electrical wiring or strange drafts. She looked at me with a tight, uncomfortable smile. "Not that I know of," she said, but there was something in her tone that made me think she wasn't telling the whole truth. I spent the day in meetings, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to the shadow, the way it moved, the oppressive cold of the room. When I returned to the hotel that evening, I noticed something strange. The hallway leading to room 303 felt longer. The dim light seemed even dimmer, and the air was heavy, almost suffocating. I was determined to get some sleep, so I left the television on for background noise and kept the bedside lamp lit. It didn't help. Around midnight, the cold returned, sharper this time, like it was seeping into my bones. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the far corner of the room. It started softly, like nails running gently along the wall, but it grew louder, more frantic. I turned toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. The shadow was back, but this time it wasn't on the wall. It was standing in the corner, darker than the surrounding room, a void in the shape of a person. I wanted to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was watch as the shadow shifted, its form rippling like smoke. And then it stepped closer. Next morning, I packed my things and went straight to the front desk, determined to check out early. As I handed the key back, I hesitated. "Has anyone ever reported anything strange about room 303? I asked. The receptionist's smile faltered. She glanced over her shoulder, then leaned in closer. "There is no room 303, she whispered. I stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I stayed there last night." Her expression turned pale. Room 303 was sealed off years ago. There was an incident. No one's supposed to go in there. My stomach dropped. I insisted she come with me to check, to prove that I wasn't crazy. When we reached the end of the hallway, my heart stopped. There was no door. Where room 303 should have been was just a blank wall, the faint outline of where a door might have once been visible under layers of faded paint. I don't know what I stayed in that night, but I'll never forget the feeling of that shadow watching me, waiting. I avoid hotels now, and sometimes, late at night, I feel the same cold creeping into my room, and I know the shadow hasn't forgotten me. It's just waiting for the right time to return. Was never one for antiques. They always seemed to carry a weight with them, like they had soaked up too much of the past to be entirely free of it. But when a distant family member passed and left me their estate, I didn't have much choice but to deal with the overwhelming collection of relics they'd amassed over the years. The estate was enormous, an old Gothic-style mansion that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. Walking through its halls felt like stepping back in time. Everything was preserved so perfectly it was almost unsettling. But there was one piece that stood out from the moment I saw it, a tall, ornate mirror in the sitting room. The mirror was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its frame was carved from dark wood, intricate patterns of twisting vines, and what looked like faces, human and animal, frozen mid-scream. The glass was slightly warped, giving everything reflected a faintly distorted look. The lawyer handling the estate told me the mirror had been there for over a century. Family legend says it was brought over from Europe, she said with a shrug. Some say it's cursed. I laughed it off at the time. I didn't believe in curses. But from the moment I first looked into that mirror, I felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious, just a faint unease that crept up my spine every time I passed by it. The reflection always seemed darker than it should have been, as if the room behind me wasn't quite the same as the one I was standing in. I decided to stay at the estate while I sorted through the belongings, thinking it would be easier than driving back and forth every day. The first night was quiet enough, though the house groaned and creaked like an old ship at sea. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. The air in the room was freezing, and I could hear faint whispers coming from somewhere downstairs. They were soft, almost too quiet to make out, but they were there. I told myself it was just the wind or the old pipes, but when I stepped into the hallway, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to be coming from the sitting room. And the mirror. The sitting room was dark, but the moonlight streaming through the window lit up the mirror. I could see my reflection standing in the doorway, but something about it was wrong. It wasn't just me in the reflection. Behind me, in the shadows, I could make out faint shapes. They were indistinct, like smudges of darkness, but they moved. Slowly, deliberately, toward the figure that was supposed to be me. I turned around, heart racing, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the shapes were gone, but my reflection wasn't quite right. My face seemed off, my expression colder, the eyes darker. I backed out of the room and didn't go back until morning. The next day, I decided to dig through the estate records, hoping to learn more about the mirror. I found an old journal tucked away in a desk drawer, written by one of the house's previous owners. The entries grew increasingly frantic as they progressed. The writer spoke of seeing things in the mirror that shouldn't have been there, shadows, figures, and sometimes people they recognized. One entry stood out. The mirror shows what it wants me to see, but it lies. I can't trust it, and now it's watching me when I'm not looking. The last page was smeared with ink, the words barely legible. If you're reading this, don't look into it. Don't let it see you. I didn't want to stay another night, but it was late by the time I finished packing some of the smaller items to take back with me. I told myself I'd sleep for a few hours and leave first thing in the morning. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't coming from the pipes or the wind. They were coming from the mirror. I could hear them clearly now, overlapping voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. And then I heard my name. I froze, staring at the bedroom door. Slowly, as if compelled by some unseen force, I got out of bed and walked toward the sitting room. The mirror was glowing faintly, the warped glass rippling like water. My reflection was waiting for me, but it wasn't mirroring my movements. It smiled. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was outside, standing in the driveway with the keys to my car clutched in my hand. The house loomed behind me, silent and still, but I could feel it watching me. I drove straight home, leaving everything behind. The estate remains unsold. No one wants it, not even for free. I've tried to forget about the mirror, but sometimes, when I pass by a reflective surface, I catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. And every so often, I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I hear whispers calling my name. When I moved out of my parents' house, I thought I was ready for independence. I found a cheap apartment in an older building downtown, a small one-bedroom with creaky floors and ancient pipes. The rent was low, the location was decent, and I was excited to make it my own. The landlord had been vague about the building's history when I asked. "It's just an old place," he said with a dismissive wave. "Been around for decades. You'll be fine." But from the moment I stepped inside, the apartment didn't feel fine. At first, it was little things. Lights flickering, faucets dripping, doors creaking open when I swore I'd close them. I blamed it on the age of the building. Old places have quirks, right? But then I started hearing noises at night, soft footsteps in the hallway, faint whispers just on the edge of hearing. I'd get up to check, but the apartment would be empty. One night, I heard something even stranger, the sound of breathing. It wasn't mine. It came from the corner of my bedroom, where the shadows always seemed a little too dark. A week after moving in, I decided to tackle the one part of the apartment I'd been avoiding, the closet in the bedroom. It was an old, heavy thing with a warped wooden door that didn't quite close all the way. I don't know why it unsettled me. Maybe it was the way it seemed darker inside than the rest of the room, or how the air around it felt colder. But I figured I was just being silly and decided to finally unpack the last of my things. When I opened the closet door, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't overwhelming, just faint and musty, like old wood and dampness. The closet was empty except for a small trapdoor in the floor. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open. Below was a crawl space, dark and narrow, with a faint metallic smell that made my stomach turn. That night, the breathing in the corner was louder. I started to notice more things. Food went missing from the fridge. Objects I'd left on the counter would show up in different places. And then there were the notes. At first, they were small, almost innocuous. A sticky note on the fridge with the word hello scrawled in shaky handwriting. Another one on my bathroom mirror that said nice place. I thought it was some sort of prank. Maybe someone had a spare key, or the landlord was letting himself in. I changed the locks, but the notes kept coming. One morning, I found a note on my nightstand. It wasn't like the others. It was longer, written in that same shaky hand. Thanks for letting me stay. I've been here longer than you, but I'll try to keep out of your way. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the building setting my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I heard the breathing again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the corner. It was right next to me. I turned on the light, heart pounding, but the room was empty. That's when I noticed the closet door was open, just a crack. Something moved inside. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it toward the closet. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating a figure crouched in the shadows. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its limbs were too long, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones. Its face was a twisted mockery of humanity, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. It smiled at me, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold my phone as I called the police. By the time they arrived, the thing was gone. The officers searched the apartment and found nothing, except for the crawl space under the closet. When they opened it, the smell hit us first, a sickly, rotting stench that made my stomach churn. Inside, they found old blankets, empty food wrappers, and dozens of notes scrawled in the same shaky handwriting. Most of them were meaningless gibberish, but a few stood out. Don't look at me. I'll be quiet. This is my home too. The officers told me it was likely just a squatter, but I knew better. Whatever had been living there wasn't human. I moved out the next day, breaking my lease and leaving behind everything I couldn't carry. I haven't lived alone since, and sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of breathing, faint and steady, coming from a corner of the room, and I wonder if it ever really left. When I bought the house, it felt like a fresh start. My husband, Ben, worked construction jobs out of state and wasn't home much, so the cozy little place seemed perfect for me to settle in while he was away. It was small but charming, a craftsman-style home with wide front steps, a wraparound porch, and a big yard for the garden I'd always wanted. The only downside was the age of the house. Built in the 1940s, it came with creaky floors, drafty windows, and a musty smell that lingered no matter how much I cleaned. My dad joked that old houses came with character, but the creaks and groans at night made it hard to appreciate. I spent my first week unpacking, hanging pictures, and imagining how I'd fix it up over time. I loved it until the noises started. It began on a Thursday night. I just finished washing the dishes and was sitting in the living room scrolling through Pinterest when I heard it. Faint scratching. At first, I thought it was the wind brushing tree branches against the side of the house. The noise seemed to come from the wall behind me, so I walked outside with a flashlight to check. But there were no trees close enough to touch the house. The scratching came again the next night. This time, it was louder and seemed to move, first behind the living room wall, then closer to the hallway. Probably mice, I told myself, though the sound was too deliberate, too sharp for tiny paws. I made a mental note to call an exterminator, but life got busy, and I forgot. By the weekend, the noises had escalated. Scratching turned into soft thuds, and I swore I heard faint footsteps at night, as if someone were walking beneath the floor. By the second week, I couldn't ignore it any longer. My husband wasn't due back for another month, and I hated the idea of dealing with a pest problem alone, but I needed answers. On Saturday morning, I gathered my courage and headed to the basement. It was unfinished, with exposed beams, cobwebs in the corners, and a cold, damp smell that made me shiver. I brought a flashlight and my phone, ready to call for help if I found anything unusual. At first, everything looked normal, just the old furnace, some storage boxes, and a pile of tools left by the previous owner. Then I noticed it. A small crawlspace door near the back wall, partially hidden behind a stack of old paint cans. The door was wooden, no more than 3 feet high, with a rusted metal latch. I'd never noticed it before. Curiosity got the better of me. I moved the cans aside and crouched down to unlatch the door. It creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel that smelled of damp earth. I aimed my flashlight inside and froze. There was a makeshift bed, a tattered sleeping bag on top of cardboard, surrounded by empty water bottles and crumpled snack wrappers. Someone had been living there. My stomach churned as I backed away, heart pounding. I locked the crawlspace door and ran upstairs, calling the police. 2 officers arrived within minutes. They searched the basement and the crawlspace but found no one. Probably a squatter, one of them said, jotting down notes. We'll keep an eye on the area, but it doesn't look like they're here now. That should have reassured me, but it didn't. Someone had been under my house, eating, sleeping, and listening to me go about my life, completely unaware. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards made my skin crawl. I kept the lights on, clutching my phone like a lifeline. 3 days passed without incident. I started to convince myself that the squatter had moved on until the 4th night. It was nearly midnight, and I was brushing my teeth when I heard it again, scratching. This time, it was coming from directly below me. I stood frozen in the bathroom, listening as the scratching grew louder, more frantic. Then came the faint sound of breathing, heavy, labored breaths just below the floor. I ran to my room, locked the door, and called 911. When the police arrived, they found him, a man in his 40s, disheveled and gaunt, hiding in the crawlspace. He had a knife and a notebook filled with disturbing notes about me, my routines, what I ate, even what I wore to bed. The man was arrested, but I couldn't stay in that house. The thought of him watching me, waiting for the right moment, was too much to bear. To this day, I double-check every door, every lock, and every corner of my home. I never want to feel that vulnerable again. It was the winter of 2004. I was 19, living alone in a cabin tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I'd taken a gap year after high school to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. My parents thought I was crazy for choosing such isolation, but to me, it felt like freedom. The cabin belonged to my uncle, who let me stay there rent-free as long as I maintained the place. It was simple, no internet, no TV, just a fireplace, a gas stove, and a small collection of books. I spent my days hiking, writing in my journal, and working part-time at a diner in the nearest town, about 15 miles away. Winter had come early that year, blanketing the woods in snow. By late December, the roads were barely drivable, and I'd started spending most of my time indoors. I didn't mind. The quiet was peaceful, and the fire kept the cabin warm and cozy. But everything changed the night of the first blizzard. The wind howled as I sat by the fire, a mug of hot chocolate in hand. Snow battered the windows, and the cabin creaked under the weight of the storm. It was the kind of night that made you grateful to be indoors. Around 11 p.m., I decided to head to bed. As I got up to turn off the lights, Something caught my eye, a faint smudge on the sliding glass door that led to the porch. The porch light was off, so I couldn't see clearly, but the smudge looked like a handprint. My first thought was that it was mine, left there earlier in the day. But as I stepped closer, I realized something was off. The handprint was too large, much larger than mine, and it was fresh, the moisture glistening in the faint light of the fire. My heart raced. Who would be out here in the middle of a snowstorm? I grabbed a flashlight and aimed it at the door, but the beam only reflected off the glass. I couldn't see anything beyond it. I locked the door and checked the other windows, making sure they were secure. Then I turned off the lights and went to bed, telling myself it was nothing. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a sound that sent a chill down my spine. Footsteps crunching in the snow, circling the cabin. I froze, straining to hear over the howling wind. The steps were slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. Gripping the flashlight, I crept out of bed and peered out the window. The snow was still falling heavily, but I could make out the faint outline of a figure standing near the edge of the porch, just beyond the reach of the light. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. Backed away from the window, heart pounding. I didn't have a phone, the cabin didn't have service, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite. Then louder, more insistent. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I grabbed the fire poker and stood near the door, trying to decide what to do. Then I heard it, a faint tapping on the living room window. I turned slowly, and my blood ran cold. A face was pressed against the glass, pale and distorted by the frost. The eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with a strange intensity. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the rug. The face disappeared, and the footsteps resumed, circling the cabin again. I barricaded myself in the bedroom, shoving the dresser against the door. The footsteps continued for hours, sometimes stopping near the windows, sometimes near the door. At one point, I thought I heard the doorknob rattling, but I was too terrified to check. The storm finally subsided around dawn, and with it, the footsteps stopped. When the sun rose, I gathered the courage to look outside. The snow was littered with footprints, circling the cabin again and again. They led to the windows, the porch, even the back door. But there were no tracks leading away. Whoever had been out there was either still hiding or had vanished into thin air. I packed my things that same day and left the cabin, never looking back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night. But sometimes, when I'm alone and hear the wind howling, I swear I can still hear the faint crunch of footsteps in the snow. Being home alone was never a big deal for me. My parents often went out for date nights or to visit friends, leaving me to my own devices. I loved the freedom, blasting music, eating junk food, and binge-watching whatever I wanted. That night was no different. My parents were heading to a charity gala and wouldn't be back until late. I waved them off, ordered a pizza, and set up a movie marathon in the living room. It was a cold, rainy night, the kind that made you want to curl up with a blanket and ignore the world. The rain pattered against the windows, and the occasional rumble of thunder added a cozy backdrop to my evening. But by the time the second movie started, things began to feel off. I was halfway through my pizza when I heard it, a loud thud, like something heavy had fallen. I froze, the slice halfway to my mouth, and listened. The sound had come from the basement. The logical part of my brain told me it was nothing, maybe an old pipe settling or a box falling over. Our house was old, and the basement was full of random junk my parents had been meaning to clear out for years. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I muted the TV, straining to hear over the rain. For a moment, there was only silence. Then it happened again, a louder thud, followed by a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. Grabbing the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, I made my way to the basement door. The air felt colder as I approached, and my hand hesitated on the doorknob. "Hello," I called, trying to sound confident. No answer. I opened the door, the hinges creaking loudly, and peered down the stairs. The basement was pitch black, the faint beam of my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. Step by step, I descended, the wooden stairs groaning under my weight. The smell of damp earth and mildew filled my nose, and the chill in the air made my skin prickle. I scanned the room with my flashlight. Everything looked normal, just the usual clutter of old furniture, cardboard boxes, and tools. Then I saw it. Near the far corner of the basement, behind an old couch, a pair of boots stuck out, partially hidden by shadows. My heart stopped. The boots were attached to legs. Someone was lying behind the couch, motionless. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure shifted slightly, and a man's face emerged from the shadows. His skin was pale and grimy, his eyes wide and unblinking. He stared at me, his expression somewhere between fear and rage. I screamed and bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. The operator tried to calm me as I explained what had happened. "Stay on the line," she said. "Officers are on their way." I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and locked myself in my bedroom, pressing my ear to the door. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving from the basement door to the living room. The creak of the floorboards was deafening in the silence. He was inside. I stifled a sob, holding my breath as the footsteps grew closer. For a moment, they stopped right outside my bedroom door. I gripped the knife tightly, heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Then, just as suddenly as they had stopped, the footsteps retreated. The flashing lights of the police cars were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The officers entered the house and found him hiding in the basement. He was filthy, clutching a small bag that contained a few stolen items, a watch, some jewelry, and a set of spare keys my dad had stored in the basement. But that wasn't the worst part. They found a journal in the bag, filled with notes about me, what time I left for school, when my parents were usually out, and even details about the clothes I wore around the house. He'd been watching me for weeks, planning his break-in for a night when I'd be home alone. I couldn't sleep for months after that. Every creak of the house sent me into a panic. My parents installed a security system, but it didn't help the feeling that I'd lost something that night, my sense of safety. To this day, I can't be home alone without triple-checking every lock and keeping a weapon nearby. The thought of him standing outside, watching and waiting, is a fear I'll never shake.
It was past midnight, and my room was quiet, save for the hum of the ceiling fan. Just as I was drifting into a light sleep, my phone buzzed on the nightstand, jarring me awake. Groggily, I reached for it, expecting a spam message or an accidental call. But when I glanced at the screen, my breath caught in my throat. "Mom," it read. My hand went cold, and my pulse thudded in my ears. 6 months had passed since my mother's funeral, and the loss still felt raw. I'd stored her number in my phone, unable to bring myself to delete it, but I hadn't seen it light up my screen since the last day I saw her. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was a technical glitch or a delayed message, somehow triggered by the network. But a gnawing unease settled over me. The call went to voicemail, but seconds later, the phone buzzed again, her name on the screen once more. I sat up, a mixture of fear and irrational hope twisting my insides. What if someone had somehow taken her phone? Or what if, no, that was impossible. I answered on the third ring, my voice barely more than a whisper. Hello. There was silence on the other end, deep and oppressive. I could hear the faint hum of static, and then something else, breathing. Slow, deliberate breaths, like someone trying to steady themselves. The sound was soft but distinct, unmistakably human. My heart began to race. Hello? I repeated, my voice trembling now. Who is this? Then I heard it, a voice I hadn't heard in half a year. Come home. My mother's voice, but somehow off, as if distorted. Her words dragged slowly, thick and heavy, with a rasp that was eerily unnatural. I couldn't move. It was her, and yet it wasn't. Her tone was hollow, lacking warmth. A deep, cold emptiness lingered behind the words. Mom. I stammered, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. There was no response, only the crackling of static. But then, just as I thought the call might disconnect, she spoke again, her voice now barely more than a whisper. Why did you leave me? My blood ran cold. I hadn't left her. I'd been there, holding her hand in that hospital room, watching her slip away as the machines fell silent. I hadn't left her. She had left me. This made no sense. I was awake now, hyper-aware of every sound, every breath, every tick of the clock. My room felt smaller, the darkness pressing in around me. Who is this? This isn't funny, I managed to say, anger barely masking my terror. A low chuckle filtered through the line, dry and empty, like dead leaves rustling in the wind. Come home, the voice repeated, more forceful this time, almost angry. And then the line went dead. I sat there, frozen, staring at my phone in disbelief. My mother's face flashed in my mind, her eyes, once bright and loving, now vacant and distant, just as they had been in those final moments. I had to remind myself that she was gone, that this couldn't be real. It was some prank, some cruel joke. Or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Grief does strange things, I told myself. The next day, I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to a vivid dream, but a part of me couldn't let it go. That night, I lay in bed, tossing and turning, every creak of the house making me flinch. I kept my phone on silent, but I couldn't resist glancing at it every few minutes. The hours ticked by until, at 3:12 a.m., it buzzed. I knew without looking. Mom. My hand trembled as I picked it up. I hesitated, but then answered, holding my breath. Come home, the voice said, sharper, more insistent. This time, there was no pause, no silence. The voice continued, filled with bitterness. You left me here, alone. Tears blurred my vision. I shook my head, gripping the phone so hard it hurt. I didn't leave you. I was there. I said goodbye. My voice cracked, emotion spilling out uncontrollably. Silence. Then, almost a whisper. You left. The line cut off, but the feeling of her voice lingered, chilling and suffocating. It felt like an accusation, a reminder of every moment I'd questioned myself, every second of guilt I'd carried since her death. I lay awake, reliving the last days we spent together, trying to convince myself that I'd done everything I could, that I'd been there when she needed me. But the voice on the phone haunted me, her words repeating in my mind, echoing in the silence of my empty room. The following night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something to put this to rest. Driven by a force I couldn't fully understand, I grabbed my keys and drove, navigating the dark, familiar roads until I found myself in front of her old house. The place where she'd spent her last years. The windows were dark, the house lifeless, but something pulled me toward it. I got out, feeling the cold night air bite at my skin, each step echoing louder than the last. The front door was unlocked, which shouldn't have been possible. I was sure I'd locked it after we'd cleared out her things. But the door creaked open easily, inviting me in. The smell hit me first. Roses. The scent was heavy, overwhelming, and I froze, heart racing. My mother had loved roses, filled the house with fresh bouquets whenever she could. But now, the smell was thick and suffocating, cloying, mingling with the stale air inside. Shadows danced in the corners as I made my way down the hall, every creak of the floorboards making me jump. Then I saw her. In the living room, standing perfectly still, was my mother, or something that looked like her. Her face was pale, almost colorless, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. Her eyes, hollow and sunken, stared at me with a vacant, accusing expression. Her mouth curved upward in a sickening, twisted smile, revealing too many teeth. She reached out a bony hand toward me, her fingers trembling. "Mom," I whispered, my voice barely audible, my throat dry. "Why did you leave me here?" she asked, her voice echoing, each word stretching like it came from a place deep, dark, and far away. I stumbled back, unable to look away, terror seizing every part of me. Her figure flickered, like a bad television signal, but the accusation in her eyes remained steady, unblinking, unwavering. The last thing I remember is running, my footsteps echoing down the empty street as her voice followed me, relentless, calling me back, demanding I come home. I haven't returned to the house since that night, but I still get the calls. Every few nights at exactly 3:12 a.m., my phone lights up with her name, and the voice whispers, accusing and relentless, reminding me that some things never truly leave. It was 2:47 a.m. when my phone's shrill ring tore through the silence. I startled awake, reaching blindly for it on the nightstand, assuming it was my boyfriend, Jeff. He worked the night shift at a hospital across town, and we often exchanged late-night calls or texts just to feel close. But when I squinted at the screen, I didn't see his name. Instead, it was an unknown number, the digits unfamiliar. I nearly let it go to voicemail, but something in me, a strange, inexplicable curiosity, made me answer. "Hello," I mumbled, my voice groggy and thick with sleep. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, finally, I heard a whisper, low and trembling. "Why did you leave me here?" The voice was unmistakable. It sounded exactly like Jeff. My stomach clenched, a chill spreading across my skin. "Jeff," I whispered, my voice suddenly sharper, laced with fear. "Where are you?" More silence. But then, I heard it again, that same question, desperate and raw, tinged with fear and something else I couldn't quite place. "Why did you leave me here?" The words, the despair in his tone, shook me. Jeff was supposed to be safe at work, surrounded by people and bright lights, not out in the cold darkness, not abandoned and alone. My mind raced, my heart pounding. "Jeff, where are you? What's going on?" He didn't answer. Instead, his breathing filled the silence, shallow and quick, like he was terrified of something lurking just out of sight. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I clutched the phone tighter, my own breath catching in my throat. "Please, don't leave me here," he whispered, his voice cracking. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the line went dead. I stared at the screen, the glow of my phone illuminating my face in the darkness, casting strange shadows across the walls. I wanted to tell myself it was a prank or a mistake, some random caller who just happened to sound like Jeff. But deep down, I knew it was his voice. Every word, every strained breath, had sounded too much like him. I tried calling him back, my fingers fumbling over the buttons, heart hammering as I waited for him to answer. No one picked up. I tried again, but each time it went to voicemail, my panic growing with each unanswered ring. I told myself I was being ridiculous, He was probably busy at work, dealing with a patient or in a meeting. But something in the pit of my stomach twisted with dread. Unable to sleep, I lay in bed, clutching my phone, watching the minutes tick by, every sound in the apartment seeming louder, sharper. By the time dawn broke, I had barely closed my eyes, haunted by that voice, by the words that echoed in my mind. Why did you leave me here? Later that morning, Jeff finally came home, looking exhausted, his face drawn and pale. I rushed to him, relief flooding me as I took in the sight of him, alive, safe. But then I noticed the faint bruise on his temple, a thin line of purple beneath his hairline. What happened to you? I asked, my fingers grazing the bruise gently. He flinched at my touch. He looked at me, confusion clouding his eyes. I don't really know, he muttered, sounding distant, almost dazed. Last night's kind of a blur. What do you mean? I pressed, trying to keep my voice steady, though my heart raced in my chest. He took a deep breath, his eyes flicking to the floor as he tried to piece his thoughts together. I remember feeling dizzy at one point, just this overwhelming sense of dread, like something terrible was going to happen. And then, it's blank. The next thing I knew, I woke up in an empty parking lot, all alone, in the middle of the night. A chill ran through me, and my mind raced back to the call, to his voice, pleading and desperate. Did you call me last night? I asked, hoping, praying, that he would say yes, that there was a simple explanation. He shook his head slowly, frowning. No, I didn't have my phone on me. I must have dropped it somewhere at work. I felt the blood drain from my face. The voice, his voice, on the phone had sounded so real, so close, like he'd been trapped somewhere just out of reach. But he'd been missing for hours, unconscious, unaware of where he was or what had happened to him. I didn't tell him about the call. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. But from that night on, I was haunted, waiting for another call, dreading the moment my phone might buzz in the dark. It happened again a week later at exactly 2:47 a.m. I had barely fallen asleep when the ringing jolted me awake. My stomach twisted, a familiar dread settling over me as I reached for the phone, knowing, without even looking, that it would be an unknown number. My hands trembled as I answered, my voice barely more than a whisper. Hello. Silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. I held my breath, waiting, my pulse racing as seconds ticked by. And then I heard it again, his voice, broken and pleading. Why did you leave me here? The words were the same, but the voice was different, weaker, more desperate. He sounded like he was barely holding on, like something was draining him, slowly pulling him into the darkness. Please, please don't leave me. My heart pounded, tears pricking my eyes. Jeff, I choked out, feeling the weight of his fear, the helplessness in his voice. Where are you? He let out a ragged breath, as if every word took more effort than the last. It's so dark. I can't see anything. His voice wavered, filled with a terror that sent a chill down my spine. Please, I need you. The line went dead again. I called his number over and over, praying for an answer, but it was the same as before. No response. I sat up the rest of the night, my mind racing, haunted by his voice, by the empty, dark spaces in his memory. He was here physically, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that part of him was still out there, lost in some darkness I couldn't understand. I confronted him the next day, desperate for answers, for some way to make sense of the nightmares that haunted both our lives. But he didn't remember. Every time I asked, his face grew distant, his eyes clouded, as if his mind was shielding him from something too terrible to face. He'd changed the subject, brushing it off, but I could see it in his eyes, the fear, the confusion that lurked beneath the surface. And every night since, at exactly 2:47 a.m., My phone rings, and the voice on the other end grows weaker, more desperate, more drained, like something is stealing pieces of him with each call. He's here beside me, warm and alive, but a part of him is out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for me to find him. And I don't know how to help him. It was a quiet night, and I was catching up on work at my desk, the only light coming from the soft glow of my laptop screen. The room was still, almost unnaturally so, as if the world had held its breath. Just as I was beginning to lose track of time, my phone lit up, buzzing insistently in the silence. I glanced down and saw a number I didn't recognize. It was late, and I usually ignored unknown numbers, but something about it, the fact that it was nearly midnight, the eerie silence of my apartment, made me answer. "Hello," I said, my voice tentative. There was a long pause, just enough to make me think it was a prank call. But then, I heard a voice, a woman's voice, soft and shaky, as if she was struggling to hold herself together. Is this Josh?" she asked, her words barely more than a whisper. "No, I'm sorry. You must have a wrong number," I replied, feeling a twinge of sympathy. She sounded so vulnerable, so lost, that I almost wanted to ask if she was okay. She hesitated, her silence stretching, and I heard a faint sound in the background, something indistinct but unsettling, like a distant murmur. "Please, don't hang up," she whispered, her voice cracking, barely containing a plea. An uneasy feeling settled over me, but I stayed on the line, curiosity overriding my discomfort. "Are you all right?" I asked, glancing around the dim room, suddenly feeling the shadows pressing in closer. She took a shuddering breath. "I don't know where I am. I was at home, I think. But now everything's wrong. The walls, the doors, everything's wrong." Her voice grew faint, trembling, and I could hear the mounting terror in her words, the desperation clawing its way through her tone. I felt a chill creep up my spine. "Maybe you should call someone for help. Do you know where you are?" I suggested, trying to keep my voice calm, but my heart was pounding, a strange unease settling in my stomach. I tried," she said, her voice barely audible now. "But the calls just keep coming back to you. I don't know why, but I think it's following me." Her voice trembled, and in the silence that followed, I could almost hear her breath, quick and shallow, as though she was being hunted. The air around me felt thick, oppressive. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice softer, my curiosity now tinged with fear. "Please, you have to help me," she whispered, and I could hear tears in her voice, the weight of terror pressing down on her. It keeps coming closer. Every time I try to hide, it just finds me. I don't know what to do. Please." Her words trailed off, and the line went silent. I sat there, gripping the phone, an inexplicable dread settling over me. The call had felt too real, her fear too raw, as if she was trapped somewhere I couldn't understand, somewhere beyond my reach. I told myself it was a prank or a mistake, but the tone in her voice haunted me long after I'd ended the call. I couldn't shake the feeling of her desperation, the way her words clung to the silence of my empty apartment. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling as if someone or something was watching me from the shadows. Just as I was beginning to calm down, my phone rang again. It was the same number. My heart skipped a beat, my hands suddenly clammy. I hesitated, staring at the screen, before I pressed answer. "Hello," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's still here," she said, her voice trembling, panicked. "It's closer now. I can feel it. Watching me." Her breath hitched, and I could almost hear her heartbeat, frantic and uneven. "Please, help me." My mouth went dry, and I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. "I don't know how to help you. Where are you?" "I don't know," she cried, her voice breaking. "I thought I was at home, but nothing looks right. The walls keep shifting, and the doors, they just lead back to the same place. I can't get out. I can't escape. Her words sent a chill down my spine, and I found myself glancing around my own apartment, as if expecting the walls to start closing in on me. "Are you sure you dialed the right number?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Maybe there's someone else who can." "No," she cut me off, her voice now sharp with fear and frustration. "It won't let me. Every call I make just comes back to you. You're the only one I can reach." I felt trapped, powerless. I wanted to help her, but I had no idea how. And yet, some part of me couldn't bring myself to hang up, as though doing so would leave her alone in that terrible place. "Please," she whispered, her voice so soft I had to strain to hear her. "Don't leave me. Just stay on the line, please." I didn't know what else to do, so I stayed. Minutes passed, her breathing the only sound on the line, shaky and uneven. But then, a new sound emerged, a faint creak, like someone stepping across old floorboards. "Oh no," she whimpered, barely audible. "It's here." My heart raced, and I gripped the phone tighter. "What is it? What's there?" Her voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "It's a shadow, just outside the door. I don't know what it is, but I can feel it watching me, waiting. Every time I turn away, it gets closer." A cold sweat broke over me as I tried to process her words. It sounded impossible, like something out of a nightmare. But the fear in her voice was real, tangible. "Lock the door," I whispered, feeling a surge of urgency. "Keep it out." She let out a bitter laugh, choked with despair. "There are no locks. The doors just open on their own. I've tried everything." Suddenly, there was a crash, a muffled scream, and the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if something was stalking her, savoring each step. My blood ran cold. "Are you still there?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, terrified of what her answer might be. The line crackled, and I heard her voice, faint and trembling. "Please, don't let it take me. Please." And then the line went dead. I sat there, staring at my phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried calling the number back, desperate to reach her, to know she was okay. But every time I dialed, I was met with a recording. "This number is not in service." I didn't sleep that night. Her voice, her pleas, echoed in my mind, haunting me. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting to see the shadow she described, waiting patiently in the darkness. The hours crept by, and the silence in my apartment grew heavier, more oppressive, until I felt like I couldn't breathe. The next night, the call came again at exactly the same time. Midnight. I didn't want to answer, but something in me, a morbid curiosity, perhaps, compelled me to pick up. "Please," she whispered, her voice weaker than before, fading. "It's still here. Closer now. I don't know how much longer I can hide." I swallowed, my mouth dry. "Where are you?" She let out a hollow, broken laugh. "I don't know, but it doesn't matter, does it? It's coming for me, no matter where I go." And then the line went dead. Every night since, at exactly midnight, the calls come. Her voice is weaker each time, her words more desperate, as though she's slowly being consumed by whatever's chasing her. And every time I answer, I can feel it, that shadow she spoke of, lurking just beyond my sight, waiting, watching. I know it's only a matter of time before it finds her, and I can't shake the feeling that, one day, it might find me too. I never intended to spend Christmas alone. It wasn't the plan, but after Mom passed away in October, I couldn't bring myself to join my family at Aunt Clara's house for the holiday. Mom loved Christmas. She was the one who brought the magic to it, decorating every corner of our little cottage, singing carols and baking her famous sugar cookies. This year, I couldn't face the joy everyone else was pretending to feel. The cottage was quiet, blanketed in snow, and surrounded by dense woods. The isolation felt oddly comforting at first. I told myself I'd make the best of it. Light a fire, drink some hot chocolate, and watch one of those old Christmas movies Mom used to love. But by nightfall, the silence started to feel oppressive. At 9 p.m., just as I was beginning to doze on the couch, there was a knock at the door. 3 raps, slow and deliberate. My heart jumped. Who could it be at this hour? The closest neighbors lived miles away, and the snowstorm outside made an unexpected visitor unlikely. I opened the door to find nothing. No one. Just the icy wind howling through the trees. For a moment, I stood there, straining my ears. That's when I heard it. Faint humming, just audible over the wind. Silent Night. It was so soft I almost thought I was imagining it. I shut the door and locked it, trying to shake the unease settling in my chest. It's just the wind, I told myself. Or maybe kids playing a prank. But the humming didn't stop. By 10 p.m., it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from the edge of the woods. I turned off the lights and peeked through the window. That's when I saw them. 3 figures stood at the tree line, just beyond the porch light. They were impossibly tall and thin, their outlines barely visible in the shadows. They wore long cloaks that swayed in the wind, and though I couldn't see their faces, I felt their eyes on me. Their mouths moved, singing that same haunting melody. Silent Night, Holy Night. My hands trembled as I backed away from the window. I locked every door, every window, drawing the curtains tight. My breathing was shallow, and my heart pounded in my ears. At 11 p.m., the knocking started again. Louder this time, more insistent. I didn't answer. Instead, I crouched in the corner of the living room, clutching Mom's old rosary. Then came the voice. Will you join us? For the song? It was low and raspy, like dry leaves scraping against a window pane. I screamed, unable to hold it in. The knocking stopped, but the singing didn't. It grew louder, closer, as though the figures were inside the house. I ran to my bedroom and locked the door, but the melody seeped through the walls. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, slow and deliberate. Sleep in heavenly peace. I hid under the bed, pressing the rosary to my chest, tears streaming down my face. The door creaked open, and the footsteps stopped beside the bed. The last thing I remember was the cold, a bone-deep chill that swept over me as the voice whispered, Silent Night. When I woke up, I was outside, standing in the snow. The cottage was gone, replaced by a forest I didn't recognize. My voice joined theirs, hollow and broken, as I sang the carol. Now every Christmas Eve, we find someone new to join us. I was 9 when I found out Santa wasn't real. I wish it had been some heartwarming coming-of-age revelation, but the truth was far less magical. My parents didn't even try to keep up the illusion that year. They were too busy fighting, shouting matches that rattled the walls and filled our tiny house with tension. Christmas was an afterthought. The tree never came out of the attic, and the dusty box of ornaments stayed untouched in the corner. Mom barely cooked, and Dad spent most of his time at the bar down the street. The house smelled of stale air, a faint whiff of beer, and Mom's burnt toast. It didn't feel like Christmas at all. Maybe that's why I begged Mom to let me pick out a new stocking. The old ones, tattered and worn, didn't feel special anymore. Somehow, a new stocking would make things right again. Mom sighed and waved me off with a sure, go pick one. She barely looked up from her crossword puzzle. At the store, my eyes were drawn to a red stocking with soft white trim. It was plain compared to the flashy, glitter-covered ones with cartoon Santas and reindeer, but something about it felt warm and comforting. It reminded me of the stockings I'd seen in old Christmas movies, the kind that hung over roaring fireplaces in happy homes. I chose it, hoping it might bring a little magic back into our house. That night, I hung it by the fireplace. We didn't have a fire, of course. Our chimney hadn't worked in years, but the empty hearth was the only place it felt right. I imagined it stuffed with candy, tiny toys, and maybe even a note from Santa, even though I knew better now. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. I was lying in bed, trying to drown out the muffled sounds of my parents arguing downstairs, when I heard a faint rustling. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the windows. Our house wasn't well insulated, and the winter wind had a way of finding its way inside. But this wasn't the wind. It was coming from the living room. A soft, irregular sound, like something shifting and scraping against fabric. My first thought was that the cat had climbed onto the mantel again, but then I remembered. We didn't have a cat. I crept out of bed, careful to avoid the creaky spots on the floor. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon through the frosted windows. The rustling grew louder as I approached the living room, a wet, sticky sound joining it now. My heart began to pound. When I peeked around the corner, I froze. The stocking was moving. It swayed gently, as though something inside it was shifting, struggling. The white trim rippled as the red fabric stretched unnaturally, its shape warping and bulging. "Mom," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The stocking stopped. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for some rational explanation to present itself. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe it was a mouse. But then the stocking began to stretch again, wider this time. The top opened impossibly large, like a mouth unhinging. It wasn't just fabric anymore. It was flesh. The red turned darker, wetter, and the white trim glistened as though coated in saliva. A long, clawed hand emerged first, its fingers curling against the mantel like it was testing its strength. The claws were jagged, yellowed, and chipped, but they moved with precision, scraping softly against the wood. The hand was followed by an arm, long and thin, with skin that looked like it had been pulled too tightly over brittle bones. Then came the head. I'll never forget the head. It had no eyes, just deep, hollow sockets that seemed to drink in the darkness. Its mouth stretched from ear to ear, or where ears should have been, filled with sharp, uneven teeth that clicked together as it moved. It grinned at me, a grotesque parody of holiday cheer. "Merry Christmas," it rasped, its voice dry and crackling, like leaves crushed underfoot. I stumbled backward, my legs barely obeying as I turned to run. The creature crawled after me, its body slithering out of the stocking like an endless coil. Its limbs were impossibly long, bending at unnatural angles as it moved, scraping and clicking against the floor. "Don't run," it hissed almost playfully. "You're on the nice list." I bolted up the stairs, the creature's laughter echoing behind me. When I reached my room, I slammed the door shut and pressed my back against it, my hands fumbling for the lock. My heart raced as I listened, waiting for the sound of claws against wood. But it didn't come. Instead, there was silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. Maybe I'd imagined it all. Maybe the stress of the holidays and my parents fighting had finally broken me. Then I turned around. The stocking was hanging on the back of my door. I screamed, but the sound died in my throat as the stocking began to open again, wider and wider, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I threw myself out the window, landing in the snow below. My ankle twisted painfully, but I didn't care. I ran, barefoot and sobbing, until I reached the neighbor's house. The police didn't believe me. They chalked it up to a bad dream, exacerbated by the unstable environment at home. My parents didn't seem to notice that the stocking was gone, but I know what I saw. I never went back to that house, not even to collect my things. And every Christmas since, I've noticed something strange. No matter where I am, no matter how far I run, the red stocking always finds me. And every year, it gets hungrier. Every Christmas Eve, my parents would gather the family around the piano, and my younger sister, Clara, would sing. She had the sweetest voice, always the center of attention. But something changed the year she became obsessed with the song. The Last Carol, they called it. A forgotten Christmas tune from the 1800s, passed down by distant relatives who claimed it held a dark, unbreakable curse. No one remembered the full lyrics, only fragments. And Clara wanted to piece it back together. That Christmas Eve, after dinner, while the fire crackled, Clara insisted on playing the piano. She'd been practicing the song obsessively for weeks, her fingers dancing over the keys with unnerving precision. "I'll find the missing verse," she promised, her voice determined, a gleam of something darker behind her eyes. At first, it sounded beautiful, ethereal even. The notes filled the room, weaving a melody that was both haunting and captivating. But soon, I began to notice something strange. The air grew cold. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally long. My parents exchanged uneasy glances. The song reached its peak, a high, almost sorrowful note, and then Clara began to sing the lost words. That's when everything changed. Her voice didn't sound right anymore. It was distant, cold, robotic even. And then we realized it wasn't just her voice. It was something else. The room became heavier. The flickering candle flames turned into small, flickering eyes. Shadows moved in places they shouldn't have. "I found it," Clara whispered, her fingers still moving. "I found the last verse." Her face was pale, drained of color, yet there was a sinister smile on her lips, a knowing grin. "That wasn't a song," my mom finally choked out, her voice trembling. "That wasn't the carol we know." But Clara didn't stop. The music grew louder, more desperate. Her voice turned more guttural, inhuman even. And the worst part, it seemed as though the song wasn't just echoing through the room. It was coming from within us, from our very minds. I watched my parents fall into a trance-like state. Their bodies slumped forward, their breath shallow. I could hear them whispering fragments of the song under their breath, phrases too unsettling to comprehend. "Stop," I yelled, grabbing Clara's wrist. But her eyes glowed with something dark, something that wasn't human. "You don't understand," she hissed. "It's too late." The final verse, a terrifying, broken chant, resounded through the room. And in that moment, I felt it. A heavy weight press against my chest, pulling me into a void of endless cold. When I woke, the house was silent. The fire had gone out. The candles had melted into puddles of wax. My parents were gone. Clara sat motionless at the piano, her fingers still pressed against the keys, unmoving. Her eyes were wide open, yet hollow. Empty sockets stared back at me. I screamed. The next days were a blur. I called the police, but they found nothing. My parents' beds remained untouched, their possessions still in place. Only Clara. She sat at the piano, staring blankly, lost in her own world. They told me to put her in a mental facility. They said it was grief overwhelming her. But I knew better. The curse wasn't done. I fled the house, leaving behind everything. The memories, the history, the dark melody that consumed us. But even now, when the wind howls through the trees, I hear her voice again. That haunting song, the last verse. And it knows I won't escape it forever.